Were you in the computer side?
I was a history and economics major,
Very
but
nice.
I definitely took a lot of gov classes, and I was thinking I was going to be pre-law and be a gov major, but ended up kind of moving a couple degrees off and ending up in history and econ.
Well,
But
it overlaps so much. I mean,
yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, we have Andy Rudalevige from Bowdoin College, a professor of government and legal studies. And he specializes and talks a lot about presidential policy and politics and how and leadership. So I'm looking forward to this conversation. But before we do that, we're going to have Andrew, the other Andrew, warm us up. Here we go.
Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up with. Drew Yang Gang, that's who I hooked up. Yo, there's no place to hide now that he's arrived. I'm saying he ain't playing now with this campaign. Bang, dang, it's in. Drew, come roll with the Yang Gang.
Hello, nerds.
hello, nerds.
Andy, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I am well, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
It's always fun to connect with people from Bowdoin. It's a special place in a lot of our hearts. Tell me a little bit about yourself and what you're up to in Brunswick these days.
Well, I am, as you know, professor of government at Bowdoin. I'm the chair of the government department at the moment because I did something bad in a past life and they made me chair. So we are, in the process actually of some generational change. Some of the professors that you probably had back in the day are coming up for retirement, and we're going to have, I think, a very exciting, infusion of new blood into the department as we look towards the future and trying to understand current policy and politics. But yeah, my background, I grew up, I'm from away. For the Mainers out there, I grew up in Massachusetts, actually, and my background originally was in state and local politics in the Boston area. Worked in the state Senate for a while, worked with the Watertown, Massachusetts Town Council, served as a counselor for a term, and then kind of parachuted into grad school when my boss in the state Senate at the time decided to run for governor and did not win. So I got very excited in grad school about thinking about some of the things I had learned, working in local retail politics and applying that to the national level, thinking about institutions and individuals, how they interact. And really, the presidency is sort of the ultimate place where individuals and the institutions have to be disentangled. And sometimes they merge together, right? When I teach the presidency here, we spend a lot of time thinking about the president as a person versus the president as part of a presidency. And that's an interesting balance that even presidents have to struggle with.
Yeah. Did you feel like your presidency class got a lot more enrollment during the Trump years, given what a kind of a lightning rod of a leader he became?
Yeah, well, certainly discussions got interesting. I would say the big boost was in Obama. And then we had, I think with Trump, there was some, originally maybe even some sort of turning away, some disheartenment, certainly on a campus like Bowdoin's back in 2017. But then, that picked up, I think, because it became clear that he was unique. That's a polite way of noting that. And again, you're trying to explain, and this is something, by the way, that political scientists are already grappling with, how much of this is Trump, how much is the presidency, how much has changed as a result of Trump in the presidency. And students, I think, found it kind of exciting to grapple with that. And of course, you saw, in 2016, 18, 2020, rapidly rising turnout. People were engaged, either pro or anti-Trump. And it'll be very interesting to see, if we have indeed entered a post-Trump era, at least at the ballot box, whether we will see that enhanced turnout continue.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've heard the argument from some people. Um, I think most notably Chuck Todd always says on Meet the Press that the thing that Biden needs most to increase his popularity is for Trump to get his Twitter account back. Because
Well,
absent Trump, like a lot of these alternative leaders, like they don't have quite the they're not as compelling. One of the things about Biden was that he just wasn't Trump, and now without Trump being so front and center, I think some people feel like they've lost the activation energy. Have you noticed that at all, or?
yeah, well, I mean, certainly Biden's appeal, at least in 2020, was that he was boring, right? I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah.
Sleepy Joe, that wasn't actually such a bad thing. People were
Yeah,
ready not to have to think about the president day and night.
yeah.
Um, but you're right. I think without the sort of comparison point, and Trump, sort of just pushing his rhetoric on social media all the time. He's still trying, right? He issues these statements all the time. You hear about it, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Only the other day, was it yesterday? In fact, had a rally. Where he's pushed his way back into the political narrative. But you're right. I mean, I think day to day, Biden, was seen as sort of, blessedly boring. But maybe over time that becomes just a little bit boring.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
not that life is boring, perhaps, but I think optimism may sort of bleed into cynicism at some point, and that's something that Biden will have to guard against as he moves forward in this administration.
Were you as surprised as I guess many of us were in that? I guess when I saw Biden win, my assumption was that he would be a pretty moderate Democrat and kind of come up with middle of the road incremental improvements.
Hmm.
And personally, I was like, I'm okay with a little bit of kind of boring incremental improvements just to kind of stabilize things, especially in the midst of a pandemic. And it's interesting that at least I was surprised how kind of aggressive he's been in terms of some of his, like with the Build Back Better, kind of the ambitions to it. What's your take so far on year one of the Biden presidency?
Yeah, well, I think I would agree with you that the legislative agenda has been really ambitious, and
Mm,
especially when you think about how narrow the margins are for Democrats in the House and, of course, even more so the Senate. Um, it is interesting, as you say, Biden's, sort of persona over now, 40 plus years in public life. Remember, he's elected to the U.S. Senate in 1972. It's been a
mm-hmm.
while. Has been, sort of right in the middle of his party. And as the party has moved left, I think you've seen him shift left. Some of the things, of course, he's endorsed probably would never have been on his agenda, in sort
Mm-hmm.
of, if he had won the presidency in 1988 when he ran the first time, or, 2008 when he ran again. I do think, he's very cognizant, that he's got a fairly limited period of time, before the midterms, before you do begin to lose aspects of your own coalition. So, pushing these big bills, right, is sort of in recognition of, the ability to use Senate procedures, to win with 50 votes in the Senate. And so the reconciliation, sort of the getting into the weeds of Senate procedure has driven, I think, some of the way these bills have been packaged. And they are big, as you say, very expensive, right? If you think about
Mm-hmm.
the overall price tag, of the pandemic generally, but just of the social programs that President Biden has advocated for. You're talking in a way about doubling the size of the federal budget pre-pandemic. Which was
Yeah.
about $4 trillion. And that jumped up to about 7 trillion by 2020. Come down a little bit, and these programs are multi-year programs. They're not, all that money doesn't come at once. But even so, it is ambitious. It is big. It is more transformational than incremental. At least that's I think the hope. I think he sees himself, as someone who might be able to sort of push back against the sort of the embedded culture that Ronald Reagan maybe embodied. The idea that government is the problem, I think for Biden, government is the solution in some ways, or at least he wants to rejuvenate that idea. I think, though, if you were to ask Biden, he'd say, no, I'm not being particularly, these are all, good things. They're all added up into one huge package, but infrastructure is not particularly contentious. And that is the one area where you've had bipartisan buy-in.
Right.
Some of the pandemic relief money, maybe could have been used better. But nonetheless, it was hard to argue strongly against, continuing stimulus very early in 2021. But, as inflation rises, people, I think, are, a little nervous about the big price tag of, childcare, free college, free pre-K, a lot of the climate change measures that were built into the Build Back Better bill. So we will see. But I think he would say, right, if you were to ask him, he would say, well, these are not hugely radical. People like them, right? They want childcare. They like student loan relief. They like, enhanced food stamps or better subsidies for the Affordable Care Act. So maybe taken individually, they're not, on the far fringes, certainly of, sort of center-left politics, but they are, ambitious. I mean, if you look, he's pushed back, and this might be the other point of his rebuttal would be to say, well, I pushed back against the crazier things that my party wants me to do. They want me to pack the Supreme Court, and they want me to, add DC and Puerto Rico to, as states, and they want me to defund the police, and they want to, open borders, blah, 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 right? Some of the stuff, that he's been accused of, right? Rampant socialism, right? Has not actually been part of his agenda. So I think he would push back, but I agree. It's been an ambitious agenda, especially when it's resting on such a very thin legislative read. And you are seeing, of course, in the effort over, most recently over the filibuster and voting rights, efforts to make that thin majority stand up better, and a lot of pushback to that.
What do you think is going to happen in 24 if he runs again? I feel like he's made enemies on both sides of himself. There's the progressives in the Democratic Party who feel like he's not done enough. Actually, there's a comment in the live chat right now saying, he's failing the people, he's not getting enough done. And then you have people, on the other side, like the Lauren Bobberts or Marjorie Taylor Greens or, the Newsmax kind of crowd that are saying, he's completely turning the country into a, the next Venezuela or something like that. And do you feel like this will serve him well if he wants to get reelected, or how do you think it's going to play out?
There's always been, in a two-party system, you're going to have parties where there are factions, and, he has been, I think, whipsawed a little bit between, the progressive wing of the party, and, I think maybe his more, Senate career instincts, which are to reach out and to try to come up with bipartisan solutions. But I mean, from his perspective, he's got a problem with math, right? I mean, there are, you can't win without a majority. There's a line by Benjamin Disraeli, who was the British prime minister, in the Victorian era. And, he had a reputation for, being very witty and, making great speeches, and he was complimented for that. And he said, well, a majority is the best repartee, right? Need the votes. And so, I think you are seeing, the limits of sort of a bully pulpit approach. Joe Manchin, to take an example, right, got elected in a state where, Trump won by 30 points. Manchin is not going to be in a position to, come on board things that he thinks his constituency as extreme. Now, if you can change public opinion on the ground in West Virginia in favor of some of these things, we've seen a little bit of that. For example, we've seen some of the miners approach, coal miners, I should say, not young children. Coal miners approach Joe Manchin and, sort of say, hey, we like some of these things about climate change, about retraining. We don't see, coal mines as the future of energy in the United States. And so that approach, that kind of indirect bank shot, might work better. But on the whole, you have he won. And, if the Democrats had picked up a couple of seats in different places, Maine, say, in 2020, then they'd be in a different place, perhaps, than they are in terms of moving forward with some parts of the agenda. Biden, of course, we can talk more broadly about the administrative presidency, the use of executive action over time. But, this is, I think Biden is going to have to, walk a fine line. And, on the whole, he's going to get sniped at. I think that's going to happen, whatever. He may be, though, if you're looking ahead to 2024, as we kind of saw in 2020, he's everybody's least common denominator in a way on the Democratic side of the aisle. And so it's not an obvious other candidate who could, even if you have those factions as kind of dissatisfied, who would they be more satisfied with, that they agree on in any substantial way?
Yeah, I kind of feel like he's definitely the least common denominator, especially if the competitor in the other party is former President Trump. That is the one saving grace for Joe Biden, is that he's sort of the opposite of Trump. He's boring. He doesn't tweet a lot. He isn't known to kind of like make up a lot of things. And but it'll be interesting. Like if the Republicans, for whatever reason, put up someone who's a little bit less polarizing than Trump, a little more conventional, maybe like a DeSantis, like a Trump light, then will the Democratic Party say, "Whoa, we need to come up with someone a little more dynamic. We can't be just the the not Trump ticket anymore." Well, what's your read on the state of the GOP these days?
Yeah, well, I mean, as you say, they're trying to figure out how to beat Trump light, right? I mean, Trump brought into the voting booth a lot of people who hadn't voted, and they voted Republican. And so, we saw that in 2020 with turnout high across the board, but nonetheless, Democrats have long sort of thought kind of complacently, well, if everybody votes, then we win all the time. And, in a certain way, don't even need to convince them to vote for us. And that, wasn't quite true, right? You can certainly see aspects of that in some areas, but you also see, some success even by Trump. I mean, I think people are still trying to study this, but, how did he make inroads, for example, into Latinx communities or other communities of color, given his rhetoric, given his positions? But he seems to have done so, right, in 2020, at least in certain places, Texas and Florida, most consequentially in terms of the electoral outcomes. But yeah, so the Republicans are kind of stuck, right? How do they, keep the energy of Trump, which seems to be driven by a kind of personality worship, and yet, sort of move on generationally? Because, we got a lot of 70 and 80-year-old people clogging up the government right now. This is actually one of my pet peeves, is our failure to have sort of turned the generational page here. It's very rare to go back a generation in the presidency, but that's what we did after Obama. And we would have done it with Hillary Clinton too, by the way. Trump are, I think, the same age. So we've kind of, as a aging Generation Xer, I'm a little peeved that, we're back to the baby boomers. So anyway, that said, I think you're right. I mean, the issue for the Republicans is to try to sort of turn the page while still maintaining the energy and the, the turnout that Trump is able to generate. And I think, you're seeing different Republicans kind of experiment with that. You saw Glenn Youngkin, for example, as he ran for governor of Virginia, trying to sort of tone down, some of the rhetoric while still sort of throwing out a lot of culture war red meat, to the degree he kind of could focus on education. I think that didn't hurt him as much in suburban areas as Trump's, more overt racism, frankly, did. So there was sort of a, I think that's one formula, right? Sort of Trump in a fleece vest model, DeSantis, right, is kind of, again, he's playing around with, DeSantis is a Yale guy, right? He's not I mean, Trump, of course, is hardly of the people in any serious sense, but, does seem to have managed to capture a broader populist imagination. DeSantis, I think, is flailing around a little bit, especially in sort of moving towards the anti-vax camp. Sort of trying to shut down local control, trying to shut down business autonomy. These are not traditional Republican views, right? I mean, the sort of, a standard issue Republican governor 10 years ago would have been, very pro-business, not here's how you can run your business. And if you want to require vaccinations, right, that is going to be illegal in our state. That's just not somewhere the party would have been. So Trump has certainly shifted it. Can they shift past, at least in terms of persona? Yeah, good question. That's, I think that you're going to see over the next, obviously with the midterms coming up, you'll have new candidates kind of inserting themselves. You'll have the chance for current political figures to sort of campaign in different places and get their names out there, sort of the old Richard Nixon approach from, 1966, believe it or not, when he was, everywhere, his comeback. So, we'll see. But I do think there is this balancing act within the Republicans as well. The sort of never Trump wing is relatively, small numerically, but nonetheless does represent a lot of the sort of traditional elders of the party, if you will, and may still have some influence in things moving forward.
One thing I noticed, and I see you wrote a book about the limits of presidential power. And I'm curious, a year after the Trump, at least first term, what's your read on his impact and influence? Do you think it was a crazy 4 years? We'll look back and be like, my God, that was nutty. Or do you think there's like a long-standing kind of systemic impact he's had? Like, what do you think? What's your assessment so far?
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. And, as we were talking about before we went on air here, I'm a co-editor of a volume called The Trump Legacy, which is currently recruiting authors for. And there'll be a lot of grappling with those kinds of questions. Again, how much is Trump, just as a person who just sort of, as you say, popped on, as a limited series, if you will, right? And how much did he actually change the broader landscape? And I think probably the answer will be a little of both. In some ways, when he became president, he was constrained, by the system. The book you mentioned, which is about executive orders, actually, talks about the role of the wider bureaucracy. Trump, would call it the deep state in a disdainful way. But, that is, on the one hand, a very empowering establishment. You've got, 3 million-ish federal employees, civilians, plus the armed forces, who are, technically, hierarchically under you as president. And that's a great resource, right? A lot of what Trump accomplished substantively was actually through regulation, rule. He didn't have a lot of success with his legislative agenda once you move beyond that first year tax cut, right? But he did substantially change a lot of things with regards to immigration, environmental policy, education, right? Some of those Biden is now trying to roll back, but there were substantial changes, in the way in which federal power was exercised in a number of ways. On the other hand, right, that larger establishment can also be limiting to you as president because it has certain routines and expectations. It's hard. It's like a big freighter. You can't move it on a dime. It takes quite a while to turn it. 4 years may not be quite enough time, in fact, to really get it on board. And so, some of the things Trump did put in place, for example, with, changing cost benefit analysis, to go full nerd, actually, that's a fascinating topic, right? The how presidents use the government to conduct cost benefit analysis for regulation actually turns out to matter kind of a lot for the kinds of policies you're going to be able to promote long term. and that I think didn't take hold, right? There's a lot that didn't take hold. You have all the sound and fury, right, of the Twitter account, and the perfect phone call with Ukraine, and 2 impeachments, insurrection at the end of your term. I mean, there's a lot going on. How much did policy change in the end? Again, that's something we'll have to establish. But I think where it did change, a lot of it was in, sort of the regulatory area, in domestic policy, especially. I think some of the other efforts by Trump have, didn't really take hold. Now, that's just talking about policy, right? If you want to talk about politics, about the party, we changed the orientation. I mean, we hinted at this before, changed the orientation of the Republican Party pretty dramatically. There's not a free trade party anymore in the United States, right? There's that's gone. There's not really a pro-immigration party in quite the same way as we might have talked about that again in the early 2000s. Obviously in the Republican Party, though, at that time was, largely, pro-immigration, in part for, reasons related to free trade, right? In terms of workforce availability, in terms of cheaper labor. That was something that the party was kind of committed to. It was anti-tariff. It was pro-NAFTA, right? Clinton got NAFTA passed in part by relying on Republican votes. Biden, I think, did vote for NAFTA, but he was, sort of, again, an older school Democrat, much more in tune with labor, and actually, in a way, kind of, if you look at Bill Clinton's ads from 1992, about the hollowing out of industrial America, and it was all George H.W. Bush's fault. I mean, Trump's ads were cruder in 2016, but that was the topic. Actually, it was, he sort of picked up, from the Republican side, some of that. And, he also activated race in a way that had not been done before. And now that is very much part of our national conversation. Obviously it exploded in 2020, with the Black Lives Matter protests after George Floyd's murder. But now we're seeing, that debate, go in all kinds of different directions. Again, much more overtly than I think would have been plausible before Trump showed that could be a winning issue for the Republican side, in 2016. Now it had its downside, right? I think it turned off a lot of suburban voters in 2020 and limited the coalition. This is one reason perhaps that, we might think a Trump comeback is not likely, because in the end, he never mustered a majority of voters, right? He didn't do that in 2016. He was never above 50% approval for 4 years. He got, 47% in 2020. It's a pretty big coalition, but it's not a majority coalition. And to win the presidency, it does help. Obviously, it's not absolutely necessary, as we see if you run the table on the Electoral College just right. But it's hard to win if you can't muster a majority of Americans. So that means getting the, your 47% really excited. And, that's where we may see changes, because we are seeing that kind of, red meat culture war stuff becoming, really important in the Republican agenda, right? Mitch McConnell was asked, what's the positive platform for 2022 for the GOP? And he said, well, you'll have to wait and find out. What are they for exactly? They're definitely against Biden. Do they have a positive agenda moving forward anymore? Remember, there was no 2020 Republican platform. First time. This is a party that's 150 years old. They did not have a policy platform. Their platform was, we'll do whatever Donald Trump says we should do. I mean, that's just weird in the history of American politics. And that does, suggest, a shift in the party model, which again is different than, the policies we were talking about before.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, it definitely seems like Trump is not a policy first guy. And, his positions on a variety of issues have evolved over the years. And it does seem, when I look at least, and I acknowledge this is like a keyhole into society, but when you look at Twitter kind of political discussions, there definitely seems to be this theme of anti-establishment, anti-conventional wisdom, anti-anyone telling you what to do in any way. And that's sort of the central organizing principle of a lot of the pro-Trump folks, that, hey, I'm not gonna listen to Dr. Fauci. I don't trust Pfizer. I don't trust the Cheneys. They're not really Republicans. And Donald Trump's the only one that's willing to kind of poke the eye of this kind of large elite establishment. And I could see why it could be a very compelling argument if you are feeling like your economic prospects are not that great, and you feel like the country is changing, and the things that you value deeply culturally are no longer as paramount in society as they may have been 20, 30 years ago. Like, this whole notion of screw everybody is kind of appealing. And I worry, and you see that now, with how the Congress treats each other. They don't want to get anything done together. It seems like it's all about just owning the libs, and that'll get you your primary reelection, and that'll get you back in office.
Yeah, well, certainly the tone of discourse has changed, right, among public figures. What we used to sort of hold them accountable for, in terms of decorum, has certainly degraded, and that is, as you say, becomes part of their very charm, if you will. Certain audiences, and then of course you want to see the other side wants to see their people push back, fight back, kick some ass here, please, and and both sides, by the way, see their leaders as not good enough fighters in a way. It's always how come we're always being beaten by the people who will go to any lengths. But you see that on both sides of the divide. You probably talked about before this notion of negative polarization, where what we see over time. Ezra Klein has a nice summary of some of the research on this in his book about why we're polarized, but there's a lot of it out there. And his, the take there is really that, we certainly have always disagreed about policy. But, the sort of shift towards, identity politics in the broadest sense, right? We have now sort of incorporated politics into our identity in a way that may not have been the case before. And so, it's like rooting, for your team. Obviously, given my background, the Red Sox are good and the Yankees are evil, and all of the Yankees probably have a character flaw of some kind. Okay, well, that's fine when you're talking about sports, right? And it can be kind of fun. But if suddenly it's Republicans are good, Democrats are bad, and vice versa, not just bad in terms of the policies they want, but in terms of their very moral fiber, they're actually evil, right? They're bad people. I don't want my kids to hang out with those people. I don't want, there's, kind of a polling question about, would you want your daughter to marry somebody from the other party? That number has gone down a lot over time. And there's a certain personalization, again, that makes, it's not just that you again, don't agree with the proper response to policy problem X. It's that, you think that the other people's argument is coming from a morally degraded place. And therefore, it's almost your duty as a moral human being then to defeat them, to crush them. And so that, I think, is a bad place for us to be, because the U.S. is, extraordinarily diverse, of course. Big place physically. It really does rest, I think, on sort of loose coalitions of being willing to get along and not take offense at everything that comes down the road, and to compromise. And so, I know, the comment you showed was angry at bipartisanship, but, we have been in a place previously where, that was a norm. And it may be that was an oddity, right? That the big sort of parties of the post-war era they had, liberals and conservatives within both parties, which made bipartisanship possible. And that has shifted, right? The parties have sort of reorganized themselves. If you were a segregationist in the South in the 1940s, you were a Democrat. Now you've shifted into the Republican Party, probably. And likewise, if you were sort of an environmentalist Republican in New England, in the 1960s, you are probably a Democrat now. There's a few holdouts, Susan Collins trying desperately to, find some kind of balance. Not sure always very successfully. But, on the whole, that becomes the parties become further apart, but also more internally homogenous. And therefore that in itself is going to make, people, make compromise harder, even though, the underlying distribution of preferences in the public might not have changed that much. Right. If you just think about where people, then sort of sort themselves into, we see this geographically too, but ideologically, right, you don't have to necessarily have a difference in the underlying distribution of preferences to have two parties that move from being sort of big tent parties to, clusters that are moving further apart, kind of like weird planetary repulsion. So it's getting to your broader point, I think it is this is a big issue, right? And it's not one, I think people sort of projected onto Biden, well, he is so boring that maybe he'll solve this, but it's not a problem you can solve per se, not just sort of in your existence. There is a need, and I think it probably starts at the local level, to be honest, to try to rebuild some of the local institutions that we've moved away from, our involvement in over time.
Do you think this movement of both parties to be kind of smaller tents creates opportunities for third parties to emerge or gain a little bit more influence? I know we've not seen that in the past, but it also feels like the parties have never been more narrowly defined,
right?
At least in my kind of modern history.
Yeah. So on the one hand, right, third party movements in the past came into being in part because the parties weren't addressing a particular issue, slavery perhaps. So that's one way you can drive a third party. And the other, right, if you look back to third parties, is often, well, the parties are the same. There's not this is George Wallace, right, when he was running for president in 1968, granted as a, not an appealing third party in any way, but he would say, look, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the two parties, so you should vote for me. I'm actually a change. Well, I mean, you can't really say today the two parties are the same. That's not the issue, right? Arguably, right, there is this sort of third way, this middle ground, that we had kind of a little bit of a surge in that kind of moderation in the 90s, right? We had Bill Clinton running as a New Democrat, Tony Blair in England. You had to sort of, even I think, people who are sort of technocratic more than ideological in a certain way. And that I think has been, it's not that they weren't electorally successful, right? Clinton wins 2 elections here, Blair wins 3 in the UK. And yet we look back now and we think, oh, they didn't have any principles. That's terrible. So, I mean, in a weird way, I mean, a third party does face the problem of coming up, well, what are its principles that are going to distinguish it and win voters? At the moment, in a sense, I wonder if that is a sort of moderate, there's certainly room in the middle. There's a lot of people who don't feel that they're well represented by either party. And yet the choices that you get on the ballot are DNR for the most part. Now, electoral rules, tend to favor, if you have a winner take all system and not a proportional representation system, then you're going to tend to converge on 2 parties just as a winning strategy long term. And people do want to win elections. So what can you do, right? Well, you need to kind of change the underlying structure of the election, I think, to make it more likely that third parties can come in and represent different parts of the political spectrum. Ranked choice voting, as Maine has adopted and Alaska has recently adopted, maybe one answer for that. I mean, more fundamentally, you could see, these are bigger changes, by the way, but you could see, multi-party seats, right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says you have to have a little teeny geographic district for members of Congress. You could have at-large districts, even statewide districts, multiple member districts that might attract, a wider range of candidates into that mix. You could think about, going fully into proportional representation, instead of, a 51-49 race always coming down to, well, all right, that person won and now they get all the power. There are lots of models around the world that has not tended to be the U.S. model, of course. And we'd need to do some serious thinking about, the effects that we want. I think third parties generally do, they face these uphill battles. They face ballot access questions. But I do wonder if right now they face a question of what are you standing for that's going to differentiate you? We've got these two parties. You are getting a choice, not an echo, as Barry Goldwater put it. And so, again, I think there may be kind of a middle ground, a third party that could arise out of, sort of dissatisfaction with factionalism. But that's not necessarily an argument that gets a lot of people excited. They might like the option, but, what drives activism is purity, right? And you are on board and you're fully excited about, the far left or the far right, to be honest. It's hard to get too excited about the mushy middle, even if that might be a better governing option.
And if there were a compelling third way that voters started to resonate with voters, I guess the skeptic in me has always assumed, well, if there's one thing that the Republican and Democratic Party can agree on, it's like they probably don't want more competition for them, and they're not going to really do a lot to help, or maybe even they might even kind of actively try to suppress these efforts. Coming to you from Silicon Valley, like one of the things that's amazing about the tech industry is that anyone can start a company and have a shot at kind of this David versus Goliath victory. It just seems like so much harder in politics, like the ballot access and the money and the donors and the media coverage. What's your take on, even if there were a compelling policy kind of North Star to separate a third party, do you think they could actually get it done?
Well, you're certainly right that the parties, the existing parties, don't have any particular interest in competition. I mean, they've survived so long in part by changing over time, and so it's, obviously the Democratic Party of today doesn't look a ton like the Democratic Party of, Franklin Roosevelt's, coalition in the 1930s and 40s, and certainly not like the Democratic Party in the 1870s. And so, this has been an unusually long period in American history for the same two parties. We've normally had two major parties and sometimes regional parties that have been able to grab a foothold. Remember, we have, in the U.S., it's a geographic base of representation. So you could win, we have had parties that have sort of had a foothold in New England or the Midwest, occasionally the South, but, that haven't been able necessarily to go national. But you also have, party, shifts over time. The Republican Party comes out of sort of a dissatisfaction with the Whig Party at the time, which, replaced the Federalist Party. And so you do have, over time, we've had examples where a new party has been able to sort of wipe out an existing party. But on the whole, the parties are also pretty good about co-opting issues that people raise. And so, you might see, sort of a surge in the Green Party, and then one of the parties, in this case, the Democrats, that says, oh, we need to be a little more green because we got to get those voters. Ralph Nader screwed us over. I mean, that's an argument against third parties, right? This sort of that you have to overcome. Ralph Nader in 2000, right? Probably costs Al Gore the election. Now, Ralph Nader had every right to run and people had every right to vote for him. But if you're, someone who, strongly preferred, say, Al Gore to George Bush, and you see that in, one state, enough people can move, towards this third party to change the course of the national election, that, may taint your views towards third parties generally as spoilers, as wasted votes, which is, I think, why you do need electoral reform. You need to change the structure of the election so that the rules actually, make it possible for you not to sort of waste your vote, that you are able to express your broader preferences without necessarily, going from, voting for your first choice, but getting your last choice as the winner. And we know a lot about decision theory now. There's a lot of say out there. The problem then is, again, getting the existing parties to buy into something that will make them less likely to win. It's just, and that is, as you hint, I think, a very high bar, because parties exist to win elections. I mean, they don't actually have moral fiber, if you will. Beyond that, they don't. We ask them to do all kinds of things that sort of have normative implications, but parties want to win. That's why they exist, and so we shouldn't expect them necessarily to have, preferences for the public good more broadly. That's not why they're there, right? Any organization, unions, for example, right? They have their job is to help their members. Everything else is gravy.
You mentioned ranked choice voting in Maine. We observed ranked choice voting in the New York City mayoral race. At least from the New York City race, there was, I think, this hope that candidates like Andrew Yang, who might not be many people's first choice, but could have been a really compelling second choice for a lot of people, would do really well. And it turns out that the person who got the most first choice votes ended up winning anyway. Have you seen ranked choice voting have more of a kind of different outcome impact in Maine? Maybe how have you seen it work so far?
Yeah, I mean, it so far in Maine, because of a provision of the state constitution, it doesn't apply to actually state elections. So our governor election, for example, this coming year, will not be subject to ranked choice voting, though the primary, if there is one, will be. So federal offices and local offices can also be done by ranked choice voting. It's a little bit weird, and it's again sort of just language in the state constitution that the advocates of ranked choice voting, either because they felt they couldn't get a constitutional amendment passed, or because they didn't see it at the time, sort of overlooked anyway, and or didn't grapple with, and so it's limited-ish. However, there's even in the limited time it's been in use here, the 2nd Congressional District, which is in northern Maine, though northern Maine in terms of the boundaries of the 2nd District keep coming further south in search of more population. But the incumbent congressman, Bruce Palanquin, who was a Republican, was defeated in 2018, I guess it was, because of ranked choice voting, right? He actually did win a plurality in the original first round vote. And then Jared Golden, who's now the congressman, basically everybody who liked Palanquin voted for him first. The sort of anti-Palanquin vote, which was more than 50%, was split. But then as you went through the rounds of voting and other candidates dropped out, Jared Golden won, and then he defended his seat in 2020. Palanquin sued, actually, because he was a sore loser, frankly, and apparently had not read the part of the Constitution where it says states are allowed to organize their elections as they'd like to, shy of congressional reform. Congress, of course, can shape federal elections. So that part of the Constitution is the part that isn't being read right now by people opposing federal election reform. But Palanquin was upset. Obviously, he had lost, and he did file a federal lawsuit that was effectively dismissed because he had lost by the rules. But that is an important. That's a case, right, where there were Golden was he's pretty moderate. I actually has voted against some Biden proposals, which have earned him some anger from the left, but he fits the district pretty well, I think. And this is kind of a good example where people in that district could vote for the equivalent of Ralph Nader, right? But then their second choice was Golden. Maybe he was their third choice. I think there were 4 people in the race, but even so, they didn't get their last choice. And so ranked choice voting can at least, it's not going to have a perfect outcome necessarily, but it does provide for the opportunity of, a little more complicated assertion of your preferences than just, D or R.
Yeah. Yeah. So it sounds like when you have a race, at least one example is if you have a race where there's someone, some leading candidate that doesn't have a majority of support, and then there's like a bunch of everyone else candidates, then you can start accumulating the everyone else through ranked choice voting to actually defeat the 40% person. And maybe in New York, since they just started out with everybody being evenly split, it didn't really fundamentally change because they all kind of distributed evenly.
Yeah, my memory though is that Eric Adams, who won, right? He had a bigger lead in the first round than he wound up with. You did see
true. Yes. Yeah, it did eat away.
Not for Mr. Yang, but for a couple of the other candidates in the race who then sort of moved up.
Yes.
Quite a bit. So even there, I think you did see some shifts. I mean, ranked choice voting in some ways, you will consolidate around, the middle ground in a way that makes some sense, right? Because that's generally where the distribution of preferences are. So, it doesn't have to be a bell curve, obviously, of any real way. But, if it's true, that a population is broadly moderate, then, ranked choice voting should actually promote that. And, again, that's not always going to be what's desirable from the perspective of activists. For, I think, proportional representation, where you have, multiple seats and they are divvied up, to reflect, opinion in, a district, however you draw that district, that in a way, that's going to get you a broader distribution of preferences in office.
Yeah.
Probably.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, the problem, of course, with proportional representation is then you have, 26 people and no majority, right? And, and that has its own issues for governance. And, where you see stalemates, the multiple Israeli elections, for example, they try desperately to build coalitions across that kind of electoral outcome. Again, so there are, advantages to the simplicity of a two-party system. But, part of it depends, on how you want to think about representation and what's most important.
Yeah, no, it's a fascinating topic. I know we're a little towards the end of our allotted time. I wanted to hit two quick things with you, Boston and Bowdoin.
Okay.
So Boston, since you spent some time in state politics, did you observe the Boston mayoral race at all? And did you any thoughts on that outcome? And Michelle Wu, we had the pleasure of having her on the show when she was running. She did not strike me as a typical politician. She seemed very like even keeled and kind of methodical. And I was like, well, that's interesting. Like, we'll see if that actually resonates. Like, what was your take on the Boston race?
Yeah. So of course, my experience, when sort of was, my boss at the time in the state Senate represented part of Boston, the Allston-Brighton neighborhoods, where BU, BC are. And increasingly Harvard is over there too. So it was kind of an interesting district torn between these sort of academic institutions and then a lot of, increasingly diverse, working class population in that area. So, my experience with the mayoral races at that time was, was the days of Tom Menino, sort of the end of, I'm old, Tom. I mean, I was, around when Ray Flynn was around and, some of his successors, but Menino was there, of course, for a very long time. And then Marty Walsh, who now is the Secretary of Labor. So, I followed the most recent mayor's race a little bit from a distance. I still do have some friends in Boston politics, and their bosses were kind of maneuvering, especially in that very big primary field, to try to figure out, where they wanted to come down. And of course, you always want to be with a winner. I do think Mayor Wu was able to, convince people, pretty early that she was a contender. She's, she's young. She's actually, risen pretty fast in Boston politics. That's not that easy unless your, last name is Kennedy, so it's I'm pretty impressed with her, her profile and her, clear political skills. I have to say, I didn't follow the ins and outs of the race closely enough to get a sense of, for example, the neighborhoods in which she built her coalition. I think she's from JP. But I should anyway. I won't go too deeply in that because I don't know enough. But I do know that she was able to bring, again, from some of my friends, able to bring on sort of the more traditional, constituencies. The Suffolk County Sheriff's Department, for example, the sheriff endorsed her. Which is not an obvious way to go. So she was clearly able to build a big coalition and to sort of have the image of a winner in a way that was important towards shaping those endorsements and some of the on the ground activism that resulted.
Do you think Boston will be her ceiling, or do you think there's a broader opportunity for her down the road?
Well, every Massachusetts politician believes they should be president, so I don't know. Seriously, everyone. But no, I mean, why? Yeah, I don't know for sure. I mean, it's actually hard in a way to run for statewide office from Boston in Massachusetts, in part because it's both the biggest city and also sort of people outside of Boston kind of resent it in some ways for its success. At the same time that they love it, but we haven't seen actually a lot of sort of mayors jump into statewide races. There's some discussion of Marty Walsh actually coming back from Washington to run for governor, given that Charlie Baker is retiring. And I have no idea how serious that is. It would be an interesting test, though, because it, again, being very much identified with Boston has not always been a plus in statewide races.
Yeah.
Though, again, as we've seen with, Mayor Flynn, Mayor Walsh, there is sometimes a path to national office, especially in the administrative side of things.
We'll have to watch Mayor Wu and see how she does.
Indeed. Well, I mean, she's off to quite an amazing start in her career, I have to say. So obviously the governance challenge of any city now, is another thing to take into account, right? It's not just a question of the electoral side. You have to actually be able to govern, and that will be the proof in the pudding, if you will.
Yeah. I did have the benefit of spending a few years in the Boston area way back in the day, and we were talking about the Republican Party changing. Remember Bill Weld? Like that type of Republican will no longer would not be welcome in today's Republican Party, and it's
not in the National Party. But Charlie Baker, Charlie Baker was Weld's guy. Right. That's sort of how he came into governance. He'd been in the private sector, of course. When I guess it was all right. So again, I'm dating myself. People can look up the math here. But when I started in working in state government, Mike Dukakis was still the governor. He had actually lost his presidential race in 1988. Yet another Massachusetts guy who thought he should be president. Right. He had lost. And now he's coming back because that's the kind of guy Mike Dukakis is, extraordinarily dedicated. It was his job. Most people would have quit the governorship at that point. It's just don't let the lieutenant governor take over. But that was Dukakis had a really rigid sense of his responsibility and duties. And plus the state was kind of in bad shape fiscally at that point in the late 80s, early 90s. So, he serves to 1990. And then you have this really titanic governor's race between Bill Weld, as you say, and John Silber, who was the president of BU, Boston University, and was very strongly aligned with Bill Bulger, who was the state Senate president at that time. He's probably most famous now for being Whitey's brother, right? The gangster's brother. But he was a force in, sort of Beacon Hill politics and had a lot of clout. So it wound up, Weld won. And Weld actually, he was a smart guy, interesting guy. He was able to build kind of some weird coalitions that were quite successful. There was a little resurgence of the Republican Party in Massachusetts briefly when he was governor, and that kind of faded. He kind of lost interest, I think, in being governor. He was trying to get appointed to be ambassador to Mexico. And you'll remember he ran for Senate as well before sort of reappearing a little bit in recent years, as a libertarian. But yeah, that sort of mold of republicanism, which can win in a place like Massachusetts, statewide anyway. You see Larry Hogan in Maryland, another blue state where you have a Republican governor. But that profile, it's going to be very hard to win a Republican primary outside of your state, with that kind of profile, and it's not, you don't hate the libs enough. I mean, that's, that's the price of entry.
It's amazing that Romney was the party's nominee and, not that long ago. And now I can't imagine him being a very popular figure in the current Republican Party. Yeah.
Well, he is, of course, a federally elected official in the Republican Party, but in Utah, where he has, of course, a lot of, broader capital. But yeah, so just a quick Bowdoin link. You may know that Bob White, who was a colleague of, Senator Romney's at Bain Capital, is, the chair of the Bowdoin trustees now.
Oh, wow.
He's a great guy. And, he's actually been kind enough to visit my classes a time or two to talk about, national politics, about about then Governor Romney as he ran for president. And yeah, I mean, I think, I actually think Mitt Romney would have been a terrific president at the beginning of the pandemic. He was the kind of, manager who I think would have handled that kind of challenge really pretty well.
I feel
again,
bad.
That's not your vote. I mean, people don't tend to vote for president on, well, he's a good manager.
Yeah.
Right. That's just not high on their list usually. Maybe it should be.
Yeah, I mean, certainly in the middle of the Trump presidency, I would think to myself, I did not vote for Romney, but I was like, man, that guy would have been pretty useful at this point. And to his credit, I remember he was mocked for saying that Russia was an international kind of player that we need to be more thoughtful about and careful about. And in hindsight, he probably could have been a pretty great president, but
well, I mean, he ran up. It's always a question of timing, right? He ran up against Barack Obama, who was a phenomenally talented politician, and had not done a bad job, right? Not a fireable job as president in 2012. I do remember that comment. I think that was maybe in the first debate where there was, of that year, where Obama actually didn't perform that well against Romney. He kind of bounced back in the other debates. And so, it would have been very interesting. I mean, Romney, of course, give him credit. He did stick to his broader principles. He voted to, convict Trump in both impeachment trials. He has, sort of set out, certainly independent of this broader, the Trump wing of the Republican Party. As you say, does that mean I don't expect him to run again, but it would be hard to see, that sort of Romney Republicanism being, something that could win the nomination again, only 10 years later, really.
Yeah. Remember the huge controversy when he talked about hiring people, and he had binders full of women candidates, and the dog in the dog thing strapped to the top of the car. Like, that was like the huge deal. And now it's like, my God, it's nothing compared to what we've seen in the last, 5 years.
Well, binders full. At least he had, at least he was prepared, right? He had a list of names.
He's very organized.
Yeah.
Indeed. I'm sure sorted alphabetically and cross tabs and everything.
Actually, the Romney transition people then went to work for, so Chris Christie, right, who was the original, Trump transition person, and then gets fired the day after the election. But he had brought a lot of the Romney people on board because he knew they were prepared. They had a lot of research and sort of a plan for governance. And then, President-elect Trump discards that almost immediately. Does sort of run things by instinct.
Intuition, gut feel.
It's not the greatest way to run the presidency. The presidency, as I mentioned earlier, is a big enterprise managerially, right? It's not a private sector company. It doesn't have the same sort of incentives and constraints that private sector companies face. So I think it's always dangerous to say that your management skills in business will transfer automatically into being governor or president. But on the other hand, if you have a governor, as Romney was, right, who did show some managerial acumen, and you've learned sort of why the public sector bureaucracy is different than even a large private sector company, that can work. It's certainly a helpful part of your skill set.
Absolutely. Last question. You mentioned a little bit about generational change at Bowdoin, and one thing I noticed is do we stop calling it government and legal studies? Is it now government department?
No, it's still government and legal studies.
Oh,
It's
okay.
just longer. It's Gov, as you may remember. So
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
the shorthand.
So what do you see as the chair of the department? Like, how do you see the education of college students learning about government evolving? I'm guessing you're seeing people come into the classroom from all over the country that are probably, bring a lot of this polarization or have some of that influence, on them. Like, how are you seeing, sort of the pedagogy evolve?
Yeah, it's been fascinating, and Bowdoin, like a lot of places, has put a lot of effort into becoming a more representative place in terms of geography, race. I mean, we have students coming in from all over the country, but all over the world. And the college has made a lot of efforts, put its money where its mouth is to a large degree, to do outreach, to recruit from high schools. That it's not just sort of New England prep schools, right? It's gone well beyond to really, and I've been at Bowdoin 10-ish years, and the difference, just literally the face of the classroom has changed, and that's a good thing. It's become a more interesting place in that way, and you have students who are, as you say, bringing a much wider range of lived experiences into the classroom, though. So the challenge, in a way, if you're teaching about politics and policy, is maybe twofold. One is that a lot of students, I think, they are very interested in doing good things. You'll remember sort of the common good, right, as a theme of Bowdoin, the McKean Center for the Common Good, the offer of the college, all of these things that are really about being a good human being, but a good citizen, right, in a broad sense. And a lot of students, I think, they want to do good things, but they don't necessarily see government or politics as the vehicle for achieving those good things. And I think that's born of a frustration from watching the gridlock and the anger, and sort of feeling disempowered in some ways. And so one thing I think you want to do in the classroom is to make it clear, not in a you should be an activist sense, but here are the processes. This is how it works. Here are the entry points. Here's the ways in which the system works, and you can make it work, right? With organization and effort and diligence. And as I said earlier, the local levels of government are really accessible, and you can have an impact much more rapidly than going to be a sort of underpaid staffer on Capitol Hill. I was quite grateful in my own experience to have worked in state government first, because I think the doors were more open to a 21-year-old.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I mean, we actually, so I think sort of, getting a sense of how the system works is actually important. But also, one thing that I think has changed, and for the better, is sort of a more orientation towards, problem solving. And, these are, we have these big problems. How can we utilize the tools of our discipline, but also of, cross-disciplinary approaches to, get leverage on these problems in a very practical way? So it's not like we're just not going to study the theory of inequality, but what are actual policy proposals? What can we draw from economics, from history? We now have a program called Digital and Computational Studies, which is kind of a big data program, and you can be a major in almost anything, and then sort of within this DCS framework, be using big data to try to diagnose and then solve problems. So I think that aspect of it, again, has shifted somewhat. Obviously, we do a lot of political history. It's useful to know, right? And of course, again, as an old guy, I sort of assume people know things from a particular era, but my students were born now, after the September 11th attacks, some of them. So even talking about that as a sort of big shift moment, that doesn't resonate with them. So we do need to, generational change is good, in the faculty as well as in the political world. We are looking, to diversify the faculty as well in a way that reflects the student body and makes it a stronger place intellectually, allows us to go into fields that weren't really fields at the time when when I or my even more ancient colleagues, might have broken into discipline. So it's the churn is a good thing on the whole. It's exciting. It's an exciting place to be. And just to reassure listeners, the indoctrination of college students is not a thing. We are, we are our partners with them in learning and also learning from them. I don't think the idea that they're coming out as sort of automatons in any sense is fair.
Yeah, totally agree. I mean, even when I was there, I remember many spirited discussions and debates and seminars with is Alan Springer still teaching?
Alan is around, but Alan has talked about his retirement in the next few years. So
yeah, fair enough. I mean, it's been a while.
yeah,
So,
well, no,
yeah.
Alan's been at the college since the 1970s. Chris
Yeah.
Potholm, who you may remember,
Yeah,
did retire. Shout out to Professor Potholm.
Wow.
Who was 50 years at Bowdoin. A really amazing run. Thousands of students learned from him. So yeah, but I mean, again, we're going to be sort of looking for successors. And we expect, they will be equally as good and as important for, the next thousands of students.
That'll be amazing. That'll be amazing. And then for the students that are graduating, it's so cool to see Bowdoin really stepping up around financial aid and so that people they don't have to go to Goldman or McKinsey. They can actually think about, working in state politics or working for a nonprofit or something like that.
Yeah, and one thing that's fairly new is a Bowdoin Public Service program that has been actually sort of relying on the alumni network, not solely, but importantly, to give students a sense of different kinds of jobs that are either in or relate to, again, the public sector and policymaking. So we've been able to bring students down to, obviously the pandemic has screwed this up somewhat, but, bring down students to DC during spring break, for example, to meet with a whole bunch of folks in the executive branch and the judicial branch and the legislative branch, also in the nonprofit world, in the lobbying think tank world, to try to give them a sense of the breadth of the possibilities of public service. And as Bowdoin just, it gives aid on a, as needed basis and does not require you to take out loans, right? So all the financial aid you get from Bowdoin is in the form of grants.
Amazing.
So that's been nice, and that's made possible by really generous, friends of the college, alums, and long may it continue. I mean, I tell my students that Bowdoin alums are kind of a cult, but it's a cult that really love you, and you should take advantage of it.
There it is definitely true. It is definitely true, and kudos to whoever that team that's managing the endowment. My God, I remember when I was there, we were talking about maybe someday it could be as much as 300 million. That was like the big audacious goal, and it seems like they've done okay and managed the resources well. So excited
they have.
to see that.
And so I hope you'll be back up on campus soon. You can see what's going on, and
see if maybe walk through Hubbard Hall one more time.
Please do. Well, so not to go on, but so the Arctic Museum, which has been in Hubbard Hall forever, is now getting its own building. So there's going to be some reimagination of what's going on even in Hubbard.
I can't wait. I got to bring my kids up there, and I'll tell them some stories from the old days.
I suspect you won't tell them all the stories from the old days, but that's all right.
Yeah, we'll tell them some highlights. Well, Andy, thank you so much for coming on the show. I also want to thank Jordana Gerdzakova, who is an intern that helps us with the Nerds for Humanity show and is a junior at Bowdoin and studying at Oxford for a year abroad. But I'm really glad that she connected us and you were able to give us some of your time on a weekend. So appreciate you coming on the show.
My pleasure. And again, Jordana did a wonderful job of reaching out.
Well, with that, we'll say goodbye, nerds.
Goodbye, nerds.
See you later. All right, guys. That is the near end of the show. But I did want, I normally do this in the middle of the show, but I was so engrossed in my conversation with Andy that I forgot to thank our channel members. So I want to do that now. So if you liked this conversation and you're like, wow, Who makes that happen? Partly it's because of people like you who click that join button on YouTube and help pay for our podcast storage costs or the streaming software costs. And if any, someday we'll do a little bit more promotion of the channel. But really want to thank Soldier One, our senior vice president, our biggest supporter, for helping keep this content going. And then at the vice president level, we have Kristen Slevin, Bike, and Stephen Jones. Thank you so much. And at the hardcore nerd level, we have Mike, Gene, David, DK, Jackalego, Kirsch, Mr. History, Byron, Mona, Susan, Vaughn, Yang, Tony, Robert, Dean, Stat, Galessa, J. Perrin, AH, J. Brian, Vivian, Dana, Yoda, Jason, and Parth. And then at the entry level, which I think is just like a couple bucks a month, like $1.99 a month, is Lisa, Sugar, Albert, Brandon, Peter, Arez, your mom and Sophia, Jadwiga, Mike, Doris, Emerald, Lori, Ben, Roger, Lisa, Rasta, Elizabeth, James, Emma, Hui, Ira, Patrick, Shoni, Philip, Jameson, Dr. A, William, Karen, Monica, Ardent, Semery, Mai, David, Brittany, Alexandra, Juana, Warren, Lucky, Kevin, Finney, and H3. And our newest members overall, our youngest members, are Stephen Jones, Finney Helps, and H3 Simp. And our oldest members overall are Mike Chang, Lisa Childress, and Jean Lim. So thank you, all you nerds, for making this channel possible. Really hope to see you again in future shows. And enjoy the rest of your weekend. Stay healthy. And we'll see you in the future. Goodbye, nerds.